second century saying that the apostles were going to create a New Testament to tack on to the end of the Old Testament, and that's some idea that was alien to the first century, that they didn't know their books were going to become Scripture. No, we've seen from Scripture itself and through some other arguments that they were very much expecting that to be the case. They were expecting a New Testament canon where there is a certain list of books that are elevated to a level that other books are not considered. That is to be considered as God-breathed written Scripture. Well, today we're going to be looking at not so much biblical argumentation or the apostles and their consideration of whether or not a canon would be formed, but we're actually going to start jumping into the second and a little bit into the 3rd and 4th century to discover, is there historical evidence before there was a formal tabulation of the New Testament canon? Is there historical evidence before that that suggests there was already an understanding of the canon being developed? In other words, can we look back through historical writings and see in the first couple of generations of Christianity, people treating certain books that were written by the apostles as more authoritative and timeless and God-written than some other books that were circulating at the time? Can we find that they quote them in order to resolve controversies? Can we see that they would preach from them and involve some books in their worship services and not other books? And as we're going to see, the answer is a resounding yes from the annals of history. I want to start by looking at the myth or the critique that is often put forward, which is that what happened in about the 4th century somewhere, maybe 325 at the Council of Nicaea, or maybe people even like to push that date a bit further back and say it happened later. What they like to suggest is that there was hundreds of books. There was hundreds of books that the New Testament church was using and considering and reading and passing around and writing and preaching from and studying. And then some bullies, some people and men with an agenda and probably an army got together, chose which of those books they wanted. There ended up being 27. They said, these are now the Christian Gospels. These are now the Christian Scriptures, and these only should be taught. And then from then on, they just changed the shape of history. And they changed the shape of Christianity, what people believed. So the idea is what we're questioning. Is it true that there was a big sea of books all floating around, and out of those hundreds, some authoritative, self-appointed men picked out 27? We're going to see that the answer is a resounding no. There was, by the end of the, by the end of the 2nd century and maybe just a little bit later, there was at least 22 of the 27 books in our New Testament canon that were very much agreed upon and treated like Scripture and spoken about as Scripture. So that, now I'm not saying, and biblical historians aren't saying, that that we're saying as soon as the apostles wrote the books, as soon as the books were put into circulation, everybody everywhere accepted every New Testament book as New Testament canon, and that was decided from day dot. That's not the case. We do acknowledge that even as the books of the Old Testament did, they take a while for God to formulate the understanding among His church that these books are in fact authoritative. And so that did take some time. We've acknowledged that back in our first session. And as we're going to see today, we also have to acknowledge that some books, some of the, especially the more later written books, or some of the books which were more prophetic or apocalyptic. So, the books like 2nd Peter and the book of Revelation. Those books are argued about a bit back and forth in Christian history between different churches, some suggesting they're not written authoritatively, some suggesting and saying they are, and they argued and debated, and it was an eventual decision that they came to recognize them that they were Scripture. Again, not to make them Scripture, but to understand and submit to them as Scripture. That there was a process there that we have to acknowledge happened, and we do that, and that doesn't shake at all our doctrine of Scripture. So here I've got a timeline, and we're going to be putting different people and their opinions about the early written books on the timeline. This this is 0 AD over here, the approximate date we suggest of when Jesus was born, beginning at least of our calendar. These are 50-year increments, and over here I'm going to be putting the year 350 AD, just because that is about the last of the quotations I'll be giving today. That's the year 350. This red marker just here is where Jesus ascended up into heaven. This is about the mark of 33, and where the Spirit was sent down in Pentecost, who then began the work of the writing of Scripture. Well, let me tell you about a man by the name of Justin Martyr. Now, here in his quotation, how he actually understood or had a functioning belief that there were certain books elevated to an authoritative standard. When he writes many of his letters and gives his addresses, in fact, he was an apologist, so he would give defenses to the Greeks and to the Gentile world and defend the rationale and give justification of the Christian belief system. He says around the year 150, as he's writing, so we'll put him, what's this, 50, 100, 150. So about here, we have Justin Martyr. And he says the following. I don't have a large quote, but some references from what he says. When he quotes from the Gospels, so from the first 4 books that we have in our New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, of which there were many copies. There was not copies, but falsification. So there was others that were written later claiming to be an apostle of Peter. There's an apostle of Mary. There's the Gnostic Gospel, the Gospel of Thomas, and all these other ones that can come alongside. And the question I'm asking is, was there an early recognition that actually only the 4 we have were the true 4 written by the apostles? And there was. When Justin Martyr, as early as 150 AD, now remember, the last of the apostles died around this point here. So you've got this whole section here, which is the apostolic period. What that means is, of course, people who were alive in the apostles' time are still alive now, in the time of Justin Martyr. You could have people who are reading Justin Martyr's works who were disciples of John, and in fact that's what we find. But as Justin Martyr is referring to those 4 Gospels, which he calls memoirs of the apostles, or sometimes he just calls them memoirs, as he writes his apologetical works, he then explains to non-Christians that when he says memoirs, he's meaning the Gospels. And these, and referring just to the 4 of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, he says that these are books that we read in Sunday services of worship. We read the memoirs of the apostles or the writings of the prophets. He's referring to the Old Testament. For as long as time permits. That's his quotation. So he's saying the 4 memoirs or Gospels of the apostles and the Old Testament scripture we read in the worship service. There's a realization that they treated those 4 on the level of scripture to include it in their worship. So that's as early as 150 AD. Or we'll go further on. Actually, a little bit further back in the years of about 140 to 145. So just here. We have a man by the name of Valentinus, and he wrote probably from in the city of Rome, and he's well acquainted with the four Gospels, the letters of Paul, Hebrews, and the book of Revelation. He probably also, there's some question about it, but it seems that he references the book of Acts, 1 Peter, 1 John, and maybe some of the other books. So in as early as 140 to 145, Valentinus is referencing or quoting some authoritative texts, which include all of those books that I read, the Gospels, the letters of Paul, Hebrews, and the book of Revelation. That's a lot of what we now have as the New Testament canon. So, but we can go a little bit further. Let's look at even Clement. Now, Clement is an interesting guy. He's actually referenced by Paul as doing work with Paul in the book of Philippians chapter 4. So we can put Clement. Now, Paul died in the 60s, so we can actually put Clement somewhere, his writing, somewhere in this period here. I'll even extend that a little bit further. Who knows what point he died, but he is early on, not just overlap with the apostles in terms of time, but actually working with the apostle Paul. He cites from and treats as authoritatively in many of it. So what they can do is look at the letters, look at the books that he wrote, and in them we can see that he quotes and treats authoritatively the book of Ephesians, Romans, 1 Corinthians, 1 Timothy, and Titus. And he cites the book of Hebrews and 1 Peter at least. So he's already treating quite a large amount of the books that we have in our canon as authoritative, apostolic, and he knows what apostolic authority looks like. He's been with Paul. So this is really building quite a case. Then we can look at some of the evidence that we have pointing to 170 AD. So we're not even getting close to 350 at the moment. We're still quite early on. I'll use another red one. 170 would be around about here. And at that point, we start having a clear, well-accepted view that there are four authoritative Gospels in circulation that God has written. This is the early church recognizing that. They understand the four Gospels, as well as the book of Acts, the 13 letters of Paul, 1 Peter, and 1 John. That's an enormous amount of our New Testament that they have recognized and start using as a functional canon quite early on. With it not even 100 years later, after the death of the last apostles, they're forming this understanding. We can look actually in 170 AD. This is where they have the, wonder if this will be helpful, the Syriac, and I think it's called the Old Latin in English. What do they call it? Yeah, the Old Latin and then the Syriac Peshitta. No H there. If you can't read sideways, you're at a loss in here because I do it all the time. So we have these two books. Now, what is so significant about these two books that were written up here in 170 AD or thereabouts? Well, the significance of those is that they are translations of the New Testament, a version of the New Testament, into other languages. So coming out of the Greek into the Syriac and into Latin languages. That's quite significant. That not all letters written in those days by Christians to Christians from Christian leaders, they weren't all getting interpreted and translated into other languages, but certain books were. And those books include, now each of them, because they were from different sort of sections of the globe at that time around the Roman Empire, one of them accepts, each of them accepts slightly different combination of books because each of the letters in the New Testament were written in locations by people in history, and so they took time to really circulate throughout the world. So of course there was a natural time taken for them to spread. But we read that in let me get this right, in the Syriac text, it included all of our New Testament books except for 2 Peter, 2nd and 3rd John, Jude, and Revelation. Only those books were missing. They weren't. Now we've already said that that's okay. We've got a theology that works with that. They were yet to be accepted. They hadn't outright rejected them. They just hadn't translated them. That's a lot of our New Testament canon. Or the other one, the Old Latin, it included all of the New Testament books, all 27, except for Hebrews, James, 1st and 2nd Peter. So that's 23 of our New Testament books that were included in there. That's again an enormous amount. We simply don't have the picture that over time there was a building library of books that were all on the same level, and then eventually some people picked out a handful. But already by this time, only 70 or 80 years after the death of the last apostle, we have, while people who were alive with the apostles are still living, we have a translation and an acceptance of a large percentage of our New Testament. Just need to check that my phone's not dead. Moving on from 170 AD, we can look at 180 AD. We have Irenaeus. He was a gentleman who, now you might not agree with his reasoning, but he's at least a guy who shows us, and I'll tell you what I mean in a moment, who shows us that at that point, he also is another person we can quote to the acceptance of only 4 Gospels. Now earlier we were realizing, this was Clement down here. Earlier we were realizing that people were quoting from only those 4 Gospels in an authoritative way, but now Irenaeus over here, he actually gives a defense of the fact that there should only be 4 Gospels, and he's actually pushing back against now those who would try and include other Gospels as God written. He says this: it's not possible that the Gospels can be either more or fewer in number than what they are. For, here's his argumentation, since there are 4 corners of the world in which we live, and 4 principal winds, while the church is scattered throughout all the world, and the pillar and ground of the church is the gospel and the spirit of life, therefore it is fitting that she should have 4 pillars, breathing out immortality on every side and bringing men's flesh alive. For, from which fact, it is evident that the Word, he that sits upon the angels and contains all things, he who has manifested to men, has given us the Gospels under 4 aspects, but bound together by one Spirit. Pretty airtight argumentation, right? Now we might disagree with that. That's irrelevant. The point is that he's saying, we believe there are 4 corners of the world, and therefore it is fitting that there is only 4 Gospels that God has given to us. Whether we agree with the reasoning or not, we can see historically he believes and will defend as a prominent writer at the year 180 that there are only 4 accepted divine Gospels. That's something that the critics and the liberal scholars do not take into serious amount of consideration. But we'll keep on going. There's something called, and this is an amazing amazingly helpful historical development. But there was something found which is called the Moratorian fragment. It's a fragment of a manuscript that was found, which dates back to it was written in about 170 to 200 AD. So again, we are still in this very jam-packed little section of space just here, somewhere in that portion. We have what is called the Moratorian fragment. We have a portion of a piece of writing dated back to then, and what it says is that it gives a list of the books that are accepted as Scripture. It's very interesting. It is listed, and not just listed, but it actually includes comments on each book, a little bit of a running commentary, one book at a time. Now that list included all of our New Testament except for Hebrews, which must have still been in his part of the world, in that part of the world under debate. Hebrews, James, and one of the letters of John. All of the rest of the New Testament, right? The Gospels, Acts, all of Paul's letters, 1 Peter, 2 Peter, all of those up until the book of, even including the book of Revelation, other than Hebrews, James, and one letter of John, are all included in this defense that he's giving of the New Testament authoritative books. That fragment is very, very interesting. And I know you're not going to remember all of these things, but what you can know is keeping at the back of your mind when you hear the claim or when you hear the argument that Christian Scripture was invented later on, or the Da Vinci Code comes across your screen, or some kind of theory like that, you can at least know, no, there is historical foundational evidence showing us that the vast majority of the New Testament Scriptures were agreed upon very, very early. They were not just plucked out later, but they were agreed upon early, and they were elevated to a distinct level of authority very early. Next, though, I'll even show you more. In the year 200, we have, and this isn't an entire, quite as lengthy an argument, but it bears saying, in the year 200, we have both Tertullian of Carthage and Clement of Alexandria. They first use the term New Testament, referring to the canon now. This is so significant. They now have in their mind an understanding of a canon which is like but new from the Old Testament. We now have the New Testament. They're using that kind of language as early as 200. That's significant. Now, if we skip forward a little bit, we will find over in 315. Now, there's 200. 300 finds us over here in 315 at this little marker. What we have is Cyril of Jerusalem, and he spoke of, listen to this quote, the divinely authoritative scriptures of both the Old and New Testaments. And then he lists the 22 books of the Hebrew, he lists 22 of the Old Hebrew canon, so he misses out some of the Old Testament canon for whatever reason, but that is not that was already settled hundreds of years before his time, so that's not what we're looking at. But he then also lists 26 of the 27 New Testament books. The only one that was at this point, in his part of the world at least, the only one that was still in debate was the book of Revelation. That is very early. That is a agreed upon canon all the way up to there, with only one more book to debate and to decide and to understand whether or not it is Scripture. And then in with Athanasius, so just after, look, if I write over here, just after, over on my bookshelf over here, in the year 367, just after 350, we have the great man Athanasius. And he said, in a letter that he was writing about the time of Easter celebrations, he acknowledged that the current 27 books that we have in our New Testament, he lists them out and says that they are the only authoritative writings that God had given in the New Testament era. Now again, he's not some man with all the power who's simply plucking out certain books, but he is really just at the peak of this development over history where very early on and slowly more and more we receive a tighter and tighter definition towards the time of Athanasius, and then the councils that recognize these things. So I hope that all of that is helpful to you to understand that the narrative, that there was so many hundreds of books all floating around, and the amount of books that the New Testament church was using went like this. We're told to believe that it started with very few, just with none, but after the point of the apostles, the amount of books that the church was respecting and using as authoritative just kept on climbing. It was so many, and then all of a sudden in the councils they shot it all down to 27. That's not the case. In fact, it's almost the opposite. We have books which took their time being written here, but then at that point, from then on, the amount of books that were circulating in any kind of authoritative way really began being chiseled down and to a razor-sharp 27 later on down here. It did not increase in some kind of swollen sea of books, but it was more and more refined. So that, I hope, is very helpful. And next session, what we're going to be looking at is the notion of, once we do get into this period, and especially in the councils, when we start looking at the church in an authoritative way, recognizing officially what are the New Testament books which should be included in the canon to the exclusion of all others, to be used in our worship services, preached by our pastors, preserved forever. What criteria did they look for to understand whether or not this book or that book should be included? What was it that they were arguing about in the book of Revelation or the book of Hebrews that took so long? And we're going to look at the criteria for acceptance into the New Testament canon in our next session.